My son-in-law slammed his fist into my face. My own daughter yanked me outside by my hair, all because I refused to hand over $3 million. I sat on the curb, bleeding, shaking, and asked myself when my little girl had become a stranger. What they didn't realize was that I had already made preparations for a moment exactly like this. And 60 minutes later, their world started to unravel. I moved in with my daughter, April, the week after my 71st birthday. Not because I was incapable of living alone, not because I needed help with steps or with names, but because she told me she missed me. Said she wanted me nearby. Said her husband Russell was on board. Back then, I mistook it for love. I didn't recognize it as a tactic. Their house was on a quiet road outside Des Moines, with a wide front porch and a white swing that never moved. April hadn't up the guest room in lilac and ivory, my favourite shades. Fresh sheets on the bed, and a framed photo from her high school graduation on the nightstand. I remember standing there, suitcase still in my hand, thinking, maybe this will be good. Maybe the gap between us will finally close. It's not as though I lacked options. I had a little apartment 2 towns away. I used to work part-time at the public library, curating the historical archives and teaching genealogy workshops. That work mattered to me. So did the quiet of my own place, my small kitchen, my ceramic owl salt shakers. But April said she missed having dinners with me. Said she wanted her kids to hear family stories. I believed her. That first week things went smoothly. She brought me tea every night before bed. Russell asked about my old job. The grandkids curled around my feet while I told them how our ancestors crossed over from Wales. I felt silly for ever doubting her. Then, inch by inch, the ground shifted. April started mentioning bills more frequently. Her voice stayed airy, but the content landed heavy. She talked about refinancing, college funds, how tight the budget had become. Russell mentioned an opportunity from a client, some real estate fund with big returns and low risk. He dropped it casually over dinner one night while carving roast chicken. I nodded, but something in my chest pulled taut. A few days later, April came into my room with a folder. Inside, bank forms, a notarization page, and a printout of my investment accounts. She sat down beside me on the bed, her tone measured. She said they only needed a short-term transfer, promised they'd pay it back within 6 months, said it would secure their future and the children's. I asked where she got my account information. She smiled, but not with her eyes. She said she'd always known my passwords. Said she needed to check in on me sometimes. That night I lay on my back, watching the ceiling fan turn slow circles above me. Something inside me cracked. I thought of my late husband, how we saved for years a little at a time, never touching the principal. I thought about the $2,000 I'd loaned April to fix her transmission and how it never returned. I realised I'd moved into a house where love came with terms. By the end of week 2, I stopped sleeping with my bedroom door unlocked. Looking back now, I wonder if any of you have felt that change too. When a hug becomes a transaction, when kindness turns into currency, if you've ever trusted someone so completely that you moved into their home only to feel the walls inch inward, then you know what I mean. And if you haven't, stay with me. Because what happened next would split everything wide open. And once the curtain lifted, there was no more pretending. Not for me, not for them, not for anybody. At the start of the 3rd week, the shift became obvious. He saw it first in the grocery receipts. I always offered to cover what I used. Milk, bread, my chamomile tea. But one afternoon, April left a receipt on the counter, circled several items in red, and wrote a total beside them. Then she stuck on a note. Your share. Thanks. No greeting, no smiley face. Just a number. Later that evening, she handed me a printed breakdown of the monthly utilities, highlighted, columned, precise. She pointed at my name at the bottom, and said evenly that fairness keeps things clear. That's how families stay strong. Russell hardly spoke, but he nodded while scrolling his phone. I didn't argue. I took the paper upstairs, sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the figures. The total wasn't exorbitant, but the message was louder than the math. They didn't want a mother. They wanted a renter. A few days later, I walked in on Russell in the kitchen flipping through a small black notebook. He snapped it shut when he saw me, set it on the counter and smiled like nothing was amiss. That night, when they were out, I checked the drawer where I kept my personal folder. It was slightly off, tabs rearranged, papers not where I'd left them. I didn't need a smoking gun. I've lived long enough to trust my instincts. Something was unfolding behind my back. The next morning over breakfast, April casually raised estate planning. She asked if I'd thought about simplifying accounts. Said she'd read that joint accounts are easier in emergencies. Then she mentioned a friend's mother who'd put everything in a trust for her children, so there were no disputes later. I didn't answer. She kept talking, said this wasn't about money. It was about clarity, preparing for the future, peace of mind. Russell chimed in. He could help with paperwork. He'd done it for clients. He had templates.
He could make it smooth.
I looked down at my cereal. The milk was warm, the spoon heavy in my hand. That afternoon I called my financial advisor from my car. I didn't want to speak inside the house. I told him to set alerts on all transfers, block any unauthorized changes and flag new IP addresses. He asked if everything was all right. I said it was a precaution. By week's end, April handed me a packet. She said she'd drafted a sample transfer of authority to get the process moving. Her tone was light, like she was sharing a favourite cookie recipe. Her gaze, though, locked on mine a second too long. I didn't open it. I set it aside and asked about the kids. She let it drop. 2 days later, Russell brought it up again, this time in the garage, just the two of us. He said April was only trying to help, that I should feel lucky to have a daughter so devoted. Then he added, with a smile too sleek, that money only causes drama when people get secretive. I stepped around him, went inside, and turned the lock on my bedroom door. That night I combed through every single account. I changed passwords. I listed names of people I trusted. I scanned copies and saved them to a flash drive I hid in the lining of my suitcase. I didn't sleep much. I wasn't frightened yet, but I had begun to prepare. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition, and I'd seen this pattern before. I just hadn't wanted to look at it. Week 3 bled into week 4, and the house took on a unnerving tone. Russell's footsteps sounded heavier in the hall. April stopped knocking before entering my room. The grandkids suddenly became too busy to visit. Little isolations accumulated, slowly, then all at once. It started the morning I found my pill organizer in the wrong place. I always kept it under my bed, but that day it sat open on my dresser. Tuesday's well was empty, though I hadn't taken anything. No panic. No accusations. I tossed the pills and started a fresh set from my travel stash. I began carrying essentials in a zippered pouch that never left my side. I stopped leaving coffee unattended. One afternoon I overheard Russell in the yard, voice too loud into his phone. Pacing by the shed, his tone clipped. I couldn't catch it all, but I heard equity, consolidation, legal guardianship. Later, April asked if I'd mind signing a few refinance forms. Routine, she said. I asked why my name appeared as co-owner on their secondary mortgage. She hesitated, just long enough, then claimed it was a clerical mistake. That's when I knew I'd underestimated how far they'd go. That night, I pulled out the manila envelope hidden beneath my suitcase lining. Inside were old records from my husband's accounts, notarized copies of my trust, and a full inventory of my assets. We'd kept everything separate after he passed. That was always our plan. Russell and April didn't know my name had never been attached to the Iowa house. They assumed all I had was a condo and a retirement account. The truth? I still held a diversified portfolio, some of it offshore. I wasn't wealthy, but I wasn't dependent. The next day I visited the bank quietly. I asked for a manager. Presented ID. Requested a full review of access attempts for every account tied to my social security number. There were 2 failed logins from an IP connected to Russell's business. I asked for the highest security, biometric access, in-person changes only, voice-verified transactions. The manager didn't pry. She nodded and handled it. He got home before sunset. Dinner was on the table. April served roast pork with overcooked carrots. Russell asked about my day. I said I'd gone to the park. He nodded, appeased. That night I barely slept, not from fear but from the sense that something inevitable was about to break. It did. 3 days later, I woke to a ransacked room. My suitcase unzipped, drawers yanked open, the lining of my coat ripped. The flash drive was gone. I stood in the doorway, heart pounding. Then I went downstairs. April was in the kitchen, eyes on the counter. Russell leaned against the fridge, arms crossed. I asked if anyone had been in my room. April said maybe one of the kids had been looking for scissors. Russell suggested I'd misplaced something. They answered too quickly. I said nothing. I went back upstairs, closed the door, and picked up the landline I'd hidden behind the bookcase. A burner number my husband and I had kept for emergencies. Something we used years ago when a real estate scam came after us. I dialed a number I hadn't used in ages, my lawyer's office. His assistant answered. I gave the code word. She routed me through. Within minutes, my attorney said he could lock everything down. I told him to trigger the failsafe in my trust, remove any shared power of attorney rights, and to alert my offshore custodian that an attempted fraud had occurred. I also asked him to make a preemptive report to Adult Protective Services, just to establish a record. I wasn't accusing, not yet. I wanted a trail. Then I packed a small overnight bag, only essentials. I didn't run. I didn't cry. I simply acted. That evening, when I came downstairs, Russell stood at the fireplace holding my flash drive. He said nothing. His face wore a smug tilt. April stood behind him, her expression unreadable. It told them I was going for a walk. They didn't stop me. At the corner, a black sedan waited. My attorney had sent a driver. We headed straight to a safe place I'd set up years earlier, a small house in Ames, deeded to an old college friend who owed me a favour. The next morning, I froze anything that could be construed as joint-placed fraud alerts, moved everything into a protected, irrevocable trust. And for the first time in weeks, I slept. Not deeply, but without glancing over my shoulder. The quiet at the safe house was different. It didn't echo like theirs. It wrapped around me like a warm coat. For the first time in weeks, I could hear my own breath. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with peppermint tea, reviewing the documents my lawyer had sent. Every page had purpose. Each signature tugged a little more of my life back into my hands. Over the next 3 days, I stayed in that small Ames house. Curtains drawn, phone silenced, no news, no scrolling. Just thinking about how it came to this. How 2 people I once held as newborns, Russell and April, could become so calculating, so cold. On the 4th morning, an email from the bank arrived. Someone tried logging in with outdated credentials. Then one from my lawyer. He had spoken with the trust administrator. All assets had moved. The new structure was sealed, irrevocable, and my successor trustees, named long ago, 2 women from my reading group, both retired professors, were now legally empowered if anything ever happened to me. That afternoon, I asked to speak with the lead investigator at Adult Protective Services. They'd already opened a quiet inquiry as a precaution. I gave them everything, each incident, every document, the photos I'd taken of my rifled drawer. I mapped a timeline down to the hour of when the manipulation began. I wasn't pressing charges, yet. I just wanted a record. The officer was calm and methodical. She didn't offer empty comfort, but she did say one thing I hadn't heard in a long time, that I'd done the right thing, that I wasn't alone. Later that evening, I drove back to the city, but not to their house. I went to my friend Patrice's. She welcomed me without questions, without judgment, just a hot casserole and a clean guest room. While I stayed there, I finally let the weight land. The betrayal wasn't only about money, it was about erasure. They weren't trying merely to take my accounts. They were trying to erase my self-determination, replace my legacy with their convenience. They failed. That truth steadied me when the letter arrived, a formal notice from a law firm representing Russell and April. The tone was clinical. They professed concern over my sudden disappearance and asked for a voluntary meeting to discuss a revised estate plan. They claimed I might be under undue influence, said others could be coercing me to cut them out. They referenced my age, hinted at confusion. I gave the letter to my lawyer. He read it, smiled, made a copy, highlighted every loaded term, and drafted a response, polite but unyielding. He attached proof of my legal capacity, current cognitive evaluations from a recent physical, and a timeline of documented events. He CC'd Adult Protective Services and the Federal Oversight Board. The next day, a detective from Financial Crimes called. The bank had flagged those earlier login attempts as part of a broader pattern of elder exploitation under investigation. Russell's name had surfaced before, April's too. 2 days later, I sat across from the detective. I told him everything, not just logistics, but the emotional sabotage, the way April seeded comments about my health, the way Russell used silence to steer my answers, how they chipped at my independence, disguised as concern. The detective nodded, took notes, asked if I'd testify if needed. I said yes. But I also asked for protections, for future women like me. The following week, I met my attorney to sign a formal affidavit, sealed unless charges moved forward. By then it was indisputable. I hadn't overreacted and I wasn't imagining things. I had seen clearly and acted. My last act that week was symbolic. I changed the name of the charitable fund my husband and I created years ago. It had been named for our anniversary. I renamed it the Ella Lenana Trust, after my grandmother, the strongest woman I've ever known. I restructured it so that each year a share of the interest would support women over 65 who'd endured financial abuse from within their own families. I didn't want revenge, I wanted meaning. And with that change, something in me unclenched. The anger didn't vanish, but it stopped burning. By month's end, I had officially relocated. Patrice helped me find a 2-bedroom condo on a quiet street with broad sidewalks and tall oaks. I unpacked slowly, arranged photos of my husband, framed the trust certificate with my grandmother's name at the top. That evening I brewed tea, stood at the window, and watched the wind move the trees. I had lost a family, yes, but I had reclaimed something I didn't know was missing. Myself. Understood. 2 weeks slipped by. I kept to myself, quiet and careful, in the condo Patrice helped me secure. No social media, no phone calls unless they were unavoidable. The days felt still and medicinal. I started walking again each morning just before dawn without music, only the grit of gravel under my shoes and the birds yawning the sky awake. Then the letter from probate court arrived. It had been mailed to my old address, but my lawyer had set up forwarding. Inside was a petition from April and Russell requesting a formal hearing to declare that I was unfit to manage my own estate. They invoked the Elder Concern Act, claiming I was mentally compromised and being isolated by outsiders who were exploiting me. The irony might have been funny if it hadn't cut so deeply. Attached were sworn statements from 2 of their acquaintances, people I'd met once, perhaps twice. They wrote of my supposed confusion, my alleged forgetfulness, and an invented story about a barbecue where I supposedly asked the same question 3 times. It was absurd, but it was filed, which meant it now sat in public record. I met my attorney again. He didn't so much as raise an eyebrow. He had expected exactly this. Calm as ever, he laid out the plan. We would respond with documentation, my evaluations from Dr. Kirsch, cognitive assessments, and affidavits from my financial advisor, 2 neighbours, and 3 members of the church committee I served on for 6 years, people who knew me longer and more closely than those planted witnesses ever did. But then something else surfaced, something I hadn't counted on. The detective I'd met a few weeks earlier reached back out. They had surveillance footage, bank cameras, not mine. Twice, Russell had attempted to access accounts tied to my name using documents that had been flagged as altered. That alone might not earn charges, but in context, it was a piece that fit the larger pattern. They were preparing to take it to the district attorney. That night, I sat with Patrice and told her everything I'd held back. She listened without interrupting, then offered me an idea I hadn't considered. She suggested I write to the court myself, not only a legal response, but a personal letter. "Speak as a woman," she said, "not a case file. Let the judge hear your voice before they see your face." I waited a day. Then I took out a pen, wrote by hand first. 4 pages, not just facts, but feelings. I wrote about my childhood, about raising April, about the brightness of her curiosity and her laugh. I wrote the moment I recognized she had changed. I described the silence that grew between us, louder year by year, and I explained, plainly, that protecting myself was not cruelty. It was clarity, overdue by years. My attorney typed it and included it with our packet. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. Those 3 weeks felt suspended, not peace, something held in the air, like a breath you can't release. I didn't hear a word from April or Russell, but gossip moved through our small city. The probate filing was whispered in corners. Old friends called, mostly leaving voicemails. I didn't call back, not yet. On the morning of the hearing, I wore a navy suit I hadn't touched since my husband's funeral. I smooth-combed my hair and pinned it back. No purse, just a folder with my name and a heart that had learned not to tremble. Courtrooms are colder than they look. I sat beside my attorney. April and Russell were across the aisle. April would not meet my eyes. Russell glanced once and pivoted away. The judge came in. We began. Their lawyer spoke first, sketching me as disconnected, volatile, pliable, ripe for manipulation. He floated words like isolated, withdrawn, emotionally unstable. Then their witnesses repeated vague observations, what someone told them, what they may have seen once. Then our turn. My attorney presented evaluations, statements, and a timeline, a pattern of pressure and coercion. He placed my letter on the record. The judge read quietly. When she looked up, she said it was rare to see such clarity from someone accused of incapacity. She tossed the petition without delay, calling it not merely unfounded, but an abuse of process, and referred the matter for further review. We left without addressing April or Russell. There was nothing left to say. Back home, I made tea and took it out to the balcony for the first time. The sky spread pale gold, the air scented like rain. Later, an email arrived from a small women's advocacy group. Someone at the court had passed along my letter. Would I speak at an upcoming forum? Not about litigation, but about resilience, about returning to oneself, about surviving betrayals that make no sound. I closed the laptop. I wasn't ready, but the thought lingered. Maybe healing wasn't a door that clicked shut. Maybe it looked like this. A quiet room, a reclaimed name, and a voice that finally carried its own volume. The week after the hearing, something inside me shifted. It wasn't relief so much as a new emptiness, like standing in a house after the furniture has been moved out. The echoes weren't loud, but they were everywhere. I had won, yes, but victory felt strange, like leaving a battlefield alone and holding only the silence of what you've lost. That weekend I stayed in. Patrice came by with groceries and a bundle of tulips. I didn't speak much. She didn't nudge. She sat nearby while I watered plants and sorted kitchen drawers. For the first time I noticed how steady my hands had become. No tremor, no tightness, just a slow settling. That night, I opened the storage box I'd carried from the old house, photographs, journals, and a leather folder of letters Russell wrote me back in college. Awkward handwriting. Little jokes. Earnest promises to care for me when I grew old. I stared at one letter, then set it aside. I reached for my own journal, not the one with passwords and lists, the unlined one I hadn't used since the year after my husband died. On a fresh page I wrote, "I am still here." I didn't know exactly what I meant, but the words felt solid. 3 days later, I met with my lawyer again, not out of necessity, but to talk about what comes next. Not legal next, personal next. He mentioned the trust, the Elelanena Fund, and how our first grants could go out within 6 months. Applications were already coming in, women of many ages writing about loss, survival, and quiet reinvention. He asked whether I wanted to remain anonymous. I thought about it a long time, what it means to stand in public where others might reach for your name in the dark. To stand, not in spite of what happened, but because of it. I told him no. Put my name on it. That evening I walked the neighbourhood. I passed a small park, benches painted powder blue, children racing in spirals. I sat for a moment, let the late sun rest on my face, and thought of April. Not with anger or even disappointment, just with stillness. She had chosen. Russell had too. Now it was my turn to choose, and this time not as a reflex. Not to guard what I had, but to define who I would be. Back home I brewed tea and opened a blank document on my laptop. For the first time in years I began to write my story, not as a case study or an article, but as a life, flawed, quiet, whole. It began with the sentence from my journal, "I am still here," and the words began to move like water. 3 weeks after deciding to go public with my name on the Elelanena Fund, a letter came from a federal investigator. It arrived directly. No lawyer, no courier. Hand-signed, tidy type, no extra procedure. A single calm line at the bottom. They were reopening the inquiry into Russell. My fingers didn't shake as I set the letter down. I didn't feel fear, only a tautness in my chest, a reminder that the past was not yet finished with me. The next day, I met the investigator, a young man to hold so much authority but patient-eyed. He explained that several suspicious transfers had surfaced in a broader county investigation into elder exploitation, and 2 names kept returning, Russell and April. I listened, then gave them what I had. More importantly, I gave them what only I could provide, the story behind the numbers. Not a rant or a catalogue of slights, just clean facts, sharp as glass. How April seeped into my digital accounts. How Russell pressed for power of attorney with no time to think. How I had mistaken their manipulation for concern. The investigator leaned in and said they had subpoenaed bank voice recordings for certain wire authorizations. In one, a man identified himself as my son-in-law, speaking my full name and social security number. The consent was never recorded and the voice was not mine. The machinery of justice had started to grind, and I was no longer the only person who could hear it. That night I sat alone in the dark living room. The refrigerator hummed. I didn't cry, didn't shiver, but I felt it, the low thrum of reckoning. It wasn't vengeance. It was gravity. 2 days later, Patrice stopped by with a binder, thick, tabbed, full of proposals and notes from the small board we'd formed for the Elelanena Fund. They suggested expanding, more applicants, broader outreach, a partnership with a university program teaching digital literacy and personal finance. I read through it and paused at a paragraph buried near the end, a speaker series for women over 60. Real stories of rebuilding, private battles, quiet triumphs. They had penciled me in. I said neither yes nor no. That night I returned to the balcony. Early summer heat clung to the air. A siren murmured a few blocks away. I didn't flinch. I considered what it meant to speak, not whisper in a journal, but speak, for myself and for the 100 women whose applications I had read, pages full of disbelief and gaslight and erasure dressed as care. The hardest part was realizing my story wasn't rare. It was common, ordinary, and that ordinariness demanded noise. So I agreed. 2 weeks later, I stood for the first small gathering, in the basement of the public library. Folding chairs, coffee and paper cups, no microphone. I told the truth. Not all of it, just enough. I told them I was 69, that I raised a daughter I loved, that she left me slowly, 100 small choices instead of one slam of a door. I told them about Russell and the bathroom floor, and the long stretch of silence afterward. Mostly I spoke about waking up, about learning that survival is not the finish line. Dignity matters more than peace. No inheritance and no shared last name can outrank a woman's voice when she finally says, "Enough." No applause, just quiet, a few tears. But the silence had changed, no longer the hush of shame but the hush of recognition. Afterward, a woman named Eloise took my hand. She was 73. Her daughter emptied a home equity line and vanished. She hadn't told a soul until that night. Her voice cracked. She didn't stop. And in that moment, I understood the real legacy. Not the fund, not the court, not even the restored name. It was this. Somewhere in that room, a woman breathed easier because I spoke first. By late summer, the Elena Fund's name began to travel, quietly, from non-profit circles to retirement communities. No fanfare, just traction. I agreed to another talk, this time at a women's centre in Greenville, 40 minutes from my place. They printed small flyers with my name, the time, and a title I hadn't chosen, Speaking Through Silence. The phrase sat heavy in my chest all the way there. The room was warm and fluorescent, coffee already brewing. I waited at the back while volunteers checked chairs. I wore nothing special. A blue knit top, cotton slacks, the silver watch Russell gave me in 1984. Funny that I still wore it, not for sentiment, only because it keeps time well. When it was my turn, I didn't rehearse. I simply told the truth again, a slightly different hue. I spoke about what follows after. Sitting in your own home without waiting for footsteps behind you. Cooking for one and not feeling punished by it. Paying your own bills and feeling grateful for the quiet click of confirmation. A few women nodded. One reached for her purse to find a tissue. Afterward, a woman with salt and pepper hair asked to walk me to my car. Judy, 71. Her story unfolded slow and familiar. A daughter who took over, a son-in-law who handled paperwork, and suddenly she couldn't access her own checking account. She whispered she had no one else to tell. I gave her a number, not mine, the centre's, and asked her to call in the morning. They had volunteers trained for exactly this. She folded the paper like a lifeline. That night, sleep wouldn't come, not from nerves, but from weight. The stories piled up like fallen leaves, the same dry ache rustling through each one. There was no end. For the first time, I wondered if I was strong enough to keep holding the space. Morning brought oatmeal, and a still air that felt like a held note. I sensed another shift and couldn't yet name it. 2 days later, my lawyer phoned. The federal investigation had advanced. Charges were being drafted. Multiple counts, identity theft, elder abuse, financial coercion. Russell's name appeared. So did April's. It didn't shock me, but it stung. Then came the press request. A national outlet preparing a feature on financial abuse of seniors had heard about the Elena Fund. Would I go fully on record? I asked for a day. I walked for hours, past the post office, the old community theatre, a bakery that now served vegan muffins and lavender tea. The world had altered while I spent years trying to simply endure it. Now I was standing inside it again. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. I agreed. The article ran a week later. My name, my face. A photograph of me outside the library after a talk, sunlight skimming the edge of my hair. The headline was simple. She spoke up. No angry calls from April. No messages from Russell. Just quiet, but not the kind that haunted. This one felt earned. The following week, something I hadn't expected happened. A university student reached out, studying non-profit leadership, asking to intern with the Elena Fund. Her grandmother had been among our first applicants and cried at her acceptance. The student wanted to help other women feel seen. I said yes, not only because we needed hands, but because I recognized it. Continuity. Proof that what we were building was not about me at all. It was larger. That afternoon, while I filed grant paperwork and updated budgets, I realized a small, astonishing thing. I hadn't thought about Russell or April for hours. Not from fear, not from pain. I simply hadn't thought of them. They had finally vacated my mind, and that, more than any ruling or headline, felt like the true beginning. The day the letter appeared, I had just returned from the hardware store, carrying a new light bulb and a bottle of vinegar. The envelope lay on the porch table, slightly off-center, cream-coloured and thick. No return address, just my name written in a sharp, deliberate hand. I recognized that script instantly. April's. My fingers stayed steady as I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet, only a few sentences long. She wrote that she had heard about the Elena Fund, that she had seen my picture in the paper, and that Russell had told her they'd made mistakes. They wanted to make peace. They wanted to meet for dinner, just to talk, just a quiet evening. She listed the time and place, a small restaurant in a part of town I hadn't visited in years. Not far from the courthouse, actually. Friday, 7 o'clock. I placed the letter down and went to boil water. I didn't need time to decide. I wasn't going. Still, I didn't destroy it either. I left it there for 2 full days, sitting beside the kitchen clock. I suppose I needed to understand why I wasn't angry anymore, why her invitation didn't sting, why the silence inside me felt so solid. By Friday afternoon I had nearly forgotten about it. It wasn't until the light outside turned that deep golden hue that I remembered the hour she'd written down. 7 o'clock. Then 7:30. My phone rang. Unknown number. I ignored it. It rang again, then again. Finally I picked up. It was a nurse from the emergency department. April had been admitted with chest pains. Mild, she said, but enough to warrant testing. They found my name listed as her emergency contact. My name. I sat on the edge of the bed, the phone pressed to my ear. In the background I could hear monitors, voices, movement. I asked if April was stable. The nurse said yes, then hesitated, and added that April had asked for me. She was alone. I didn't answer right away. I looked down at my hands, at the fine lines and pale veins tracing through them. I thought about the woman who had dragged me by my hair, who had slammed a door in my face, who had made me feel like a stranger in my own home. And then I thought about the little girl who used to fall asleep on my chest every Sunday after church, who cried when she misplaced her stuffed elephant, who used to braid my hair with her tiny fingers and whisper that I smelled like lavender and paper. So I went, not because forgiveness had bloomed, but because some small part of me needed to see her as she really was now. The hospital room was hushed. She looked smaller than I remembered, her hair tied loosely back, an IV snaking down beside her. She blinked when I entered, eyes slow to focus. Then her mouth moved. She said my name. I didn't speak. I only pulled a chair closer and sat. The nurse nodded quietly and shut the door behind me. For a long moment we just sat in that quiet. Then April said she had read everything. The statements, the articles, the interviews. She said she hadn't realised how far she'd gone, that she didn't know what she'd become, that Russell had kept pushing, that she thought she was protecting what they had built. I listened. I didn't respond. Then came something unexpected. She asked if I had created the Elena Fund as a message for her. I shook my head. Told her it wasn't vengeance, it was breath reclaimed. Her eyes filled, but the tears never fell. She said she couldn't undo what had been done, but she wanted to start over, not as mother and daughter, not under any label. Just two people who had once shared something true. I stood up slowly, not abruptly, just enough to keep my balance steady. I told her I didn't hate her, but I also told her I didn't belong to her anymore, that my peace didn't depend on her guilt. Then I left. Outside, the sky had deepened to navy. Cars hummed through the parking lot. I exhaled, not relief, something deeper. I had looked into the eyes of the woman who broke me, and she no longer had power over me. That night, I made soup, not out of hunger, but because I wanted something warm, something human. I lit a candle, not as prayer, just as calm light. For the first time in years, I slept through the night without waking once. The next morning, I brewed a stronger coffee than usual, the kind that grips the throat a little longer. I stood at the window as the postman passed by like a metronome, bag swinging. But this time he didn't stop at the mailbox. He came straight to the door, handed me an envelope, nodded. It was from the office of the United States Attorney. I closed the door and sat before opening it. My fingers were deliberate, but inside my heart braced, not for fear, for certainty. The letter confirmed what I had quietly hoped. Federal charges were being filed against Russell. Fraud, coercion, financial abuse of an elder. Pages of dates, filings, testimonies, and my name appearing again and again. Not as a victim, but as a primary witness. There had been an anonymous tip to the IRS 3 months earlier. An audit exposed enough to launch a full investigation, and here was the part I hadn't expected. The anonymous tip came from April, the same woman who had dragged me down by the hair. The same woman who sat across that hospital room days earlier. She had turned him in, quietly, before the dinner invitation, before the hospital. She had done it alone. I read the letter twice, slowly, letting the truth soak in like rain on heavy soil. Whatever her reasons, guilt, fear, redemption, it didn't matter. She had cracked open the very house she'd helped build. I set the papers down beside a pile of seed catalogues near the window. Spring was coming. The earth would thaw soon. Maybe I'd try tomatoes again. A week later, a federal officer visited. Plain clothes, polite eyes, but the badge was real. He said my testimony would speed things along. He said Russell had already been questioned, and that his tone shifted the moment he learned April had cooperated. There wasn't an arrest yet, but the tide was turning. When he left, I sat in silence for nearly an hour. I didn't call anyone, didn't text. I just wandered the house, touching the edges of furniture, the roughness of door frames, the kitchen drawer that stuck when it rained. These were the things they never took from me, the pieces of a life they couldn't reach. That evening I turned on the television, not to watch, just to fill the space with sound. Then I reached for my journal, the one in the small drawer under the coffee table, the one I began the week I left their house. I flipped to a blank page and started writing, not about them, about me. About rediscovery, my spine, my silence, the pulse in my chest at dawn when I walked barefoot through the hallway and felt no fear. The slow bloom of dignity after being buried under someone else's version of love. Justice didn't need to look like handcuffs. I just needed them to know I had survived, and I'd done it without their permission. Later that night, my phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. It was April. Her voice sounded hollow, smaller somehow. She said Russell had left. That agents had come earlier that day. That he'd packed a suitcase and slammed the door without a word. She said she didn't know where he went. Then she said she was sorry again, but this time it didn't sound like apology. It sounded like release. I didn't call her back. Instead, I stepped outside, wrapped my shawl around my shoulders, and listened to the trees whisper in the dark. No yelling, no slammed doors, no footsteps behind me. Just air, cold, clean, and mine. For the first time in years I was exactly where I wanted to be, And in that quiet hum of a world still spinning, I smiled, not from triumph but from peace earned. 3 days later, another letter arrived from my attorney. I almost ignored it. My mornings had become sacred again. Coffee slow, sunlight crawling across the wood floor. But something about the thickness of the envelope tugged at me. Inside was a copy of a document that made me sit down hard. Apparently months ago, before the confrontation, before the bruises, I had signed something I didn't remember. It involved consolidating assets into a trust. I remembered Russell's quick explanations, his printer whirring, his voice assuring me it was routine. But this one had never crossed my desk. It had moved $3 million from my brokerage account into a holding company, under his name. The transfer hadn't gone through only because of the fraud alert I'd requested at the bank. My lawyer had cross-checked the paperwork and uncovered more. April's name had been added too, but conditionally. It would activate upon an official declaration of my incapacity. I stared at the page, a chill settling into my bones. My daughter had signed a plan that only worked if I disappeared. She had built a future from my absence, and Russell had orchestrated every step. But that wasn't the worst part. At the bottom, my lawyer had handwritten a note. He said he'd compared the document dates with my medical records, legally, and the timelines matched my fall. The one I thought was an accident, the bruise on my neck, the dizziness, the pills I never remembered taking. It wasn't difficult to see the pattern. They hadn't wanted just my money. They wanted my silence. They had tried to incapacitate me, softly, legally, permanently, and yet here I was, breathing, whole, alive in a world they couldn't control anymore. The evidence now lived in a locked drawer in my attorney's office, stamped, sealed, impossible to erase. I went outside after reading it. The wind bit at my face, but I welcomed it. I needed to feel something real. I sat on the back steps, pulling my sleeves down over my hands, and thought about every meal I'd ever cooked for April as a girl. The lean years after her father died, when I'd taken a job at the college admissions office to keep things afloat. She never knew the sacrifices because she wasn't supposed to. But now, the woman she'd become had turned her back on the hands that built her. She had signed her name to my disappearance. And Russell, he had treated it like strategy, as though I were just another piece in a chess game he was sure he'd win. But he forgot one thing. I had lived through worse. The story of April and Russell was nearly over, not with courtroom noise but with quiet resolution. A woman sitting on her porch, coffee in hand, pulse steady, dignity unbroken, because real survival isn't loud. It's calm. It's absolute. It was a Thursday morning when I walked into the courthouse alone. No makeup, no jewelry, no hurry. My attorney had filed everything already, but I came anyway, to witness the closing of that chapter. The clerk recognized my name, offered a respectful nod. Inside chambers, the annulment of the fraudulent trust was approved. The frozen funds restored. The power of attorney voided. My name, my own full legal name, reinstated as the only authority over my life. No cheers. No applause. But deep inside something exhaled. Outside, I sat on the stone bench across from the courthouse. The sun felt warmer than it had in months. I had a small flask of tea. I sipped it slowly and felt the heat spread through me. A woman walked by with a tiny dog in a stroller. Our eyes met, and for a second it felt like she knew. Not the whole story, just the weight of surviving and still standing. When I got home, I didn't go inside right away. I walked around to the potting bench by the side of the house. My fingers ached to be in soil, to press life back into the earth. That afternoon I planted pansies, purple and white. Tough little things. They don't look like much, but they endure frost. They come back when winter tries to erase them. A week later, Russell called. I let it ring. He left a voicemail. His voice was lower now, worn down. He said he was sorry. Said April wanted to talk. Said they'd made mistakes. I deleted it. A few days after that, another envelope came. No return address. Inside was a photo. April younger, holding her daughter, smiling. The edges frayed. I held it for a long moment. I didn't cry, but I didn't throw it away either. I placed it in the desk drawer I rarely open, the one where I keep the things that matter but no longer define me. I'm not angry anymore. Not exactly. There's quiet now, a different kind of quiet. Not emptiness, clarity, like a room finally cleared of echoes that don't belong. And in that quiet I found something I never expected. Peace. Not the kind granted by justice, but the kind that comes when you choose yourself. When you take back your breath, your name, your voice. I don't live in reaction anymore. I live in response to who I've become. If this story stirs something in you, if someone once tried to shrink your worth, know this. It's never too late to take your voice back. Have you ever walked away from someone you love to protect the piece of yourself they kept trying to erase? Your story matters too. You are not alone.